All right. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon for this webinar and conversation about food policy councils and food chain labor. We have a few more people trickling in, but we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Karen Bassarab, and I'm with the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future. And we're delighted to be hosting this conversation with researchers from Syracuse University and practitioners and people working on the ground in Philly, Whatcom County in Washington, and with the Good Food Purchasing Program. For the conversation today, we'll be focusing on kind of how food policy councils address and work around food chain workers and labor issues, kind of some of the challenges, what they're doing to support that work. This topic has been one that's been of interest from food policy councils, and we've seen it growing over the years. We were delighted when Laura Ann Minkoff-Zern and Jonnell Robinson and Frank Sarfo with Syracuse University came to us and asked if we could use the data from our Census of Food Policy Councils and kind of really dig into what's happening with labor and food policy councils and their work to address it. So they're here today to share their research and then talk with individuals that are working on the ground and share their experiences. So with that, I want to thank you all for joining us, and I'm going to turn it over to Laura Ann.
Thank you so much, Karen. And in particular, thanks to Karen and Anne from the Center for a Livable Future. We definitely could not have done this entire project without them partnering with us and being so generous with their data to help us get started. And just a very early thank you to all the participants in this research and all the different food policy councils that we spoke with, as well as our local food policy council. I saw Maura Ackerman join the conversation because some of these very early conversations started here locally in Syracuse, where we were wondering as researchers, what can we do about labor in the food system, and thinking about our local food system and our local food policy council. And in early conversations with Maura, she said, well, it'd be great if you could find out what other food policy councils have been doing around these issues. And that's really where some of these questions first started coming from. So I'm Laura Ann Minkoff-Zern. I'm an associate professor of geography and the environment here at Syracuse, and along with Jonnell Robinson and graduate student Frank Sarfo, who have been working with us. We've been doing some research on this question of how food policy councils have been addressing labor, how can they address labor, what are some of the opportunities and challenges? And so from the very beginning, the goal was to have a forum like this where we get to share out some of this research. And even better than us just sharing our research, getting to have some participants and panelists that have been doing this work themselves. Um, so I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen, and Jonnell and Frank and I um, are going to speak for about 10 minutes about the research projects and the outcomes, and then go into some questions for the panelists. We've also put together a report that's easily accessible online that I think Karen's going to put into the chat, kind of summarizing some of this research to be shared out. There'll be some more academic pieces coming out later, but the first thing was to put out something that everyone could read and share. So this research really started about a year ago with funding from the Leonard Center for Social Justice here at Syracuse University. And as I said, the question was, what role can food policy councils play in addressing the really kind of sticky and complicated issue of labor across the food system? We are looking at labor from the farm all the way through the waste stream and all the places in between, like transportation and processing and service. Um, and yeah, trying to kind of get to what's being done in the field and what can we do. So I'm going to let me change. Pass it over, I think, to Jonnell to kind of give an outline for what we're going to talk about.
Great, thanks, Laura Ann. Well, as Laura Ann said, we just want to really briefly highlight our research process and some of what our findings have been thus far, and then open it up to a larger discussion. So Laura Ann already mentioned a bit of our project rationale and just a curiosity around what the role has been and what the potential is of food policy councils to engage with labor rights issues among food chain workers. So we'll tell you a little bit about our research questions, our methodologies for collecting data, the case studies that we undertook over the last year and a half or so, and then some of the recommendations and conclusions that we've come up with thus far, and then open it up for discussion among the panelists. So I know that, we're really preaching to the choir when we talk about what's happening with our food chain workers across the United States. But as you all know, the food system is one of the largest employers in the US, but yet our workers from farm labor to waste are some of the lowest paid, and they occupy some of the least regulated jobs in the country. Many of the food system workers, especially those of color and female workers of color, earn lower wages than their counterparts and typically encounter fewer opportunities for career advancement within the positions that they hold. We also know that food policy councils focus their efforts typically on policy reforms related to food system injustices writ large. And so we were really interested to know, specifically as it pertains to labor, what some of these food policy councils have been up to. And the rationale for this was thinking that, well, food policy councils have shown to have so much success in increasing awareness of food system injustices and improving economic conditions of our food chain workers. Could they have a bigger role to play in advancing policy work and programming around food labor? So our four main guiding questions are: how are food policy councils currently addressing disparities in wages and working conditions for frontline food system workers, if at all? And if they're not, have they experienced challenges in trying to engage within that work? And what might be some of those potential opportunities to incorporate food labor concerns into policy work and agendas and their actions? And based on those who have been successful in engaging in food system labor issues, what are some of the best practices that might be incorporated into food policy councils who are thinking about getting more involved in supporting labor rights, or who have had some challenges in engaging food system labor representation? And then finally, how might food policy councils advocate for structural changes to food chain workers' wages and create opportunities for class mobility? So in order to conduct this research, as Karen and Laura Ann mentioned, we had the opportunity to partner with Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Futures Food Policy Network project to gain access to the survey that they've been sending out to food policy councils since 2016. And Frank will talk a little bit more about that survey in a moment, but that's a really interesting and exciting survey in that it collects on an annual basis so much information about how food policy councils are engaging in a variety of work, such as their policy, advocacy, and programming activities. So from that, we gleaned several examples of food policy councils who had identified food systems labor as one of their priority focal issues. And using that list of food policy councils that we gathered from the survey, we then did some deep diving into just web-based research, scanning the internet for policies, any strategic plans, and other annual reports and the like, to see what food policy councils had been talking about in terms of their work related to food systems labor. And then from there, we tried to create a pretty broad cross-section of food policy councils to participate in case studies. So we were interested in having representation from across the country, those that were operating inside and outside of government, those that represented different geographies, and that were either new or well-established, and that were working at a variety of scales, from working in their cities and towns, counties, regions, or at the statewide level. And I'll turn it over to Frank to talk a little bit more about the survey and content analysis.
All right, thank you, Jonnell. And so for our survey, the Food Policy Network works directly with food policy councils, national organizations, and other groups to support the development of state and local food policy through networking, capacity building, research, and technical assistance. And so to better inform their efforts, the Food Policy Network conducts an annual survey of their network, and they send out a survey to approximately like 250 food policy councils each year and receive responses from about 2/3 of the survey. And so for us, we analyze surveys from the 2016 to 2020 and work with the Food Policy Network project to incorporate additional labor related questions into their 2023 survey. And so we summarize which survey participants identify labor as a top 3 priority one, and also which of them have labor representation in their group. And so from 2016 until 2020, the survey one, we defined food labor as those with minimum wage standard, sick leave, working conditions, and then the 2023, it defined food labor as minimum wage standards, sick leave, working conditions, and worker training. And for the food labor representation, what the survey defined food labor representation as farm or food industry workers in 2017, 2018, and 2019 surveys. But in 2020 and 2023 survey, the food sector was defined as food workers or food worker representations, which are farm workers, waiters, and also labor unions. And so on our screen, we could see that there has been a tremendous decline in recent years about sector representation in the food policy councils. Looking at the food policy council that identified food as a priority from 2016 to 2023, you could realize that the numbers keep on changing. And also for those that have a labor representation, you could see that there has been a tremendous decline from like 2017, 2018, 50.3% to 2023, 26.4%. And so there has been a decline in those that have labor representations in their group. And so for us, after the survey that we've been able to identify those that identify labor as a top 3 priority and also have labor representations, what we did is that we conducted a thorough examination of a content analysis of these groups or food policy councils. And so we searched through their annual reports, we searched through their policy briefs, we searched through their success stories and websites, and to make sure that, yes, indeed, what they said on the survey is actually what they are doing. And so we then choose the selection of food policy councils to reach out to them for in-depth interviews and focus groups. And so in selecting these examples, we one way or the other sought representations for food policy councils that is across a range of geographic regions, grassroots versus government affiliated groups, and urban versus rural representations. And so we therefore invited these food policy council representations to take part in interviews and focus groups that were done in person and also in virtually. And so ultimately we conducted 11 individual interviews and 6 focus groups with these leaders from 10 different councils, as well as 3 interviews with representations from 3 different nonprofit organizations. And on our screen, these are the food policy councils and also organizations that we reach out to, that we did an interview and focus discussions on them. And so I think Lauren will touch base on.
Great. Thank you, Frank. So I have some quotes here. I'm just going to go a little quickly so we can get to the panel discussion where I think you're going to hear a lot more. But we just wanted to pull out from some of the different conversations. Let me see if I can minimize my, this is the problem with having the speakers on my screen here. Okay. Something that was really really stuck out to us was the opportunities for worker-led involvement. I know we'll hear about that in Whatcom County and from community to community. But also we heard about that in places like Philadelphia, and where the workers were actually coming to the food policy councils and taking the lead and saying, we need to have some initiatives. We need to do something about what's going on in our food system for workers. So this particular food policy council had a good food business guide, and The representative said it was the workers, directly impacted servers and wait and worker staff, the growers and gardeners who wanted to produce for restaurants and restaurant owners, mainly Black and Hispanic restaurant owners that wanted to get the food. We realized one of the main problems we had, right, was kind of how to address labor in all of this. And so this is kind of talking about where some of this gets started at the Food Policy Council level. Another opportunity we started to hear about was just shared interest, right? That when workers in a regional and local food system are happy in their jobs, there's going to be less turnover. And so, you know, as was spoken about here, workers have a relationship with the customers, right? This is very different from, you know, a large scale corporate or industrial food system where the local customers and the local workers really are not identified, right, and don't necessarily have something in common. So thinking about local business being represented at the Food Policy Council as well as the workers, and that there's something that they can agree upon there for building a food system. We also heard a lot about challenges, of course, and I'm sure we'll hear about that more from the panelists. But here, when labor is included, food system stakeholders become limited. Only those who are willing to work on equity can stay at the table, right? And hearing different approaches on this. Some councils saying, no, we need everyone at the table. How can we make compromises? Other councils have said, look, labor is going to be a priority. That's who we're going to keep at the table. And you know, business owners, in particular farmers, will come back. And other councils saying, actually, this was too tough and we can't deal with labor right now, right? We heard a lot of kind of why, and I'm sure people can imagine, you know, other councils saying we can't do this till we, you know, either build more trust or gain more rapport with different groups. But the challenge being that there's tension between groups and keeping everyone at the table is difficult. Like I said, we heard a lot about building trust. One state-led food policy council in particular said, we didn't feel like as a state group, the forum wasn't empowered. It didn't feel like they were going to be able to take on these issues, which they saw as more national or federal. And saying, right, we need more time to build the trust to do things like this. So we have, we have a set of recommendations. They're all in the report. So I'll just kind of put these up here for a quick minute before going to the panelists. But the idea of kind of starting with worker group, these came from the conversations, of course, right? Talking with worker groups first. Food policy councils that don't have workers at the table should reach out to the worker groups that exist and start to build that trust, right? You need to build the trust of worker groups as well as the trust of the businesses that don't want to see worker groups there. So they're feeling like there's a conversation to be had with regards to some serious power imbalances, including labor representation and things like food system planning efforts, right? So when people are looking ahead into the future, and I'm sure Whatcom County representation can talk about this, and making sure that fair labor practices are part of that plan. Common ground issues that will bring workers and locally based owners together, addressing things like economic inequality and relieving poverty more broadly. Investing time and effort in conflict resolution because there will be conflicts, and coalition building around strategies instead of avoiding these conversations. Initiating accommodations to improve the likelihood of workers being able to participate. So we heard things from, you know, making sure that the meetings are at a time that workers can come, making sure there's translation services or childcare services. If possible, providing honorariums for people to show up to meetings when this isn't their job or their priority if you really want them to be there. And then finally, we heard about good food purchasing policies that are taking place in cities like LA and Chicago and Philadelphia. And we'll hear more from Colleen about how that's been kind of centralized through different organizations. So the panelists that we have with us today, I'm really excited for us to all be able to hear more from them. Sean Hops from the Whatcom County Food Systems Committee. He's the labor representative on that committee. Liz Darrow from Community to Community, also out of Whatcom County, where she works as a labor organizer. Colleen McKinney from the Center for Good Food Purchasing. And, oh, sorry, I didn't change this. We've had some changes, but Dimka Braswell from the Philadelphia Food Policy Advisory Council. So some of the questions, I'll put them up here and then we'll put them in the chat so we can see people's faces. So some of the questions we're putting out there, what do you see as opportunities and challenges for food policy councils to engage in labor work? Who needs to be at the table for food policy councils to engage in this work? And how do you keep people at the table with differing positions? How are food policy councils, labor advocates, and other partners engaging in a good food purchasing framework? What do you think prevents food policy councils from working on these issues? And what advice would you give to a council interested in but not yet working on these issues? We'll also leave time for questions. So if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat or wait until we get to that part of the conversation. So I am going to put these questions in the chat. The first question that I'll open up, what do you see as the opportunities and challenges for food policy councils to engage in labor work? Does anybody want to start on the panel?
Considering I'm a last minute add-on. I see a lot of opportunities as a grower and a displaced farmer. One of the things that we've been able to do is not just engage with farmers like myself or other growers, but restaurant workers and other restaurant folks. And I believe and it's funny because the data reflects that the last time we've finished and presented our survey was for the 2017 year. And that information pushed us, and I do mean pushed us, to develop a good food catering guide and a good food procurement subcommittee within our own group, within our own council, because as the data said, the workers were not being represented. And you would think in a place like Philadelphia, large city, we are still under the, Pennsylvania Commonwealth. We are still a Commonwealth. So it's the legislation and business opportunity for workers is kind of weird or different because we don't have specific legislation or policy for agriculture or food procurement outside of or inside the communities of growers and restaurateurs and what have you. Everything is very much a private business, grocery stores, what have you. And when we did the survey, we realized, oh, wow, we have an amazing opportunity to not just directly engage the workers because the workers were coming to us and asking us specific questions. So were restaurant people or restaurateurs and community members, but to find out like how we could do things. And it was a very heavy lift. But that challenge gave us the opportunity to network with our community, engage in state and federal partners with farm services, National Resource Conservation, Pennsylvania Sustainable Agriculture, current groups that are here in Philadelphia that have workers, but also I'd say work directly for food insecurity, the Food Trust, because they have food bucks that works with EBT and SNAP, giving people extra money for food. Parks and Rec, Farm Philly, with their educational programs, with PHS, Pennsylvania Extension. We had to lean very heavy onto those partners as we, as the raw data came out, and we were, So, and also because this is such a diverse city, the challenge was, again, another challenge that was an opportunity, was to engage immigrants, Hispanic folks, Black, Indigenous folks from Appalachia, reaching out to our farmers and growers outside of the county to see what we could do with not just the workers, but also how we can get the food from county into the city and what have you. So it was just overwhelming, but I think it was because we had such a void of information, and then everybody just came together and just data dumped. It was very crazy, but it was also very cohesive. We had a framework of any racist, any capitalist using, I want to say communal methods, co-ops. We have the Philadelphia Co-op Association here, or Co-op Alliance here. So again, some of it was, you know, we're in an urban area. Yeah, we're privileged, but a lot of those groups were not talking to each other because they didn't understand how to talk. So, but depending on how you know, consider, you know, positive and negative interactions within the community, for our situation at least, the challenges were the opportunities, and those opportunities created an entire network of food systems with growers, restaurants, and varying quality of life agencies, healthcare. So it's positive, it's just a lot. And we tend to want to, you know, we swapping jobs, having, you know, letting people know when there's jobs available. If there's labor issues, because the restaurant workers did have a settlement here in Philadelphia some years ago, and we did help with that, and with the Department of Health, our partner. So it is, depending on how you're able to build your foundation through the through a council, having those uncomfortable conversations about race, class, ethnicity, it can be done. It can be done. But you really have to make strides to have that uncomfortable conversation sometimes. And I guess have a foundation of, we need to feed people and protect the workers. So, and I'll let somebody else take.
No, thank you. Sean, yeah, great. I wouldn't know if you
Yeah, I think before I answer the question directly, I'd just like to address the presentation and some of my takeaways, but takeaways that I got from the conclusions. I think the main revelation of this study is that essential farm and food workers are not represented at the decision-making tables that our network of food policy councils across the country provide. And so that deeply concerns me, because if we don't have identified leadership by the workers themselves, as was used in the presentation, worker-led, if we don't have worker-led representatives at the decision-making table, then how do we have a food economy or a food system that is local and democratic? How is if we don't have the voice of essential farm and food workers at the table, how are we getting to a local and democratic food system, a truly local and democratic food system? So going to the question directly and zooming in on the Whatcom Food Systems Committee. So I'm the labor sector rep on the Whatcom Food Systems Committee. It's my understanding, we were very excited when all of the sector representatives on the Food System Committee were very excited when Laura Ann approached us with this study, and we're grateful to be here to take a deeper dive into it. And you know, the Whatcom Food Systems Committee, I'm sorry, sort of lost my train of thought there, but I think that the main challenge that we faced on the Whatcom Food Systems Committee is also our greatest opportunity, that we are facing an assumed and established power structure that doesn't include us, and that there doesn't include the voice of essential farm and food workers, and that the reason for that is that we are confronting that power structure and intending on changing it, and that, I think, it threatens some of the some people at the table. It's because we're going to provide a different or an alternative economic analysis and interpretation. And I think the reason I think that's our greatest opportunity is because we do have an opportunity to identify the self-identified leadership of essential farm and food workers in our locale. And we have a chance to they have a chance to take a seat at the table, to provide their perspective, and to lead us as the most vulnerable and marginalized group, as we see from the study in the food system, lead us to a more equitable and more sustainable local and democratic food system.
Thank you. If it's all right, I might go to our next question, which is who needs to be at the table for food policy councils to engage in this kind of labor work? And how do you keep people at the table with different positions on labor issues? I don't know, Liz, if you'd be comfortable starting with that one coming from kind of farm worker organizing and yeah.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Laura. My name is Liz Darrow. I am the Participatory Democracy Program Coordinator for Community to Community Development. We focus on farm worker justice, food sovereignty, and climate justice. So what that role, I mean, that's a lot of jargon, but what that really means from my perspective is creating relationships that are sustainable with people around how we engage with policy and shape the systems from the ground up. And that, as John was just talking about, is a huge challenge because a lot of people who sit on councils and governance don't want to share those power spaces. It's messy, it takes time. And I also wanted to second what Dimka said, which I think is the fundamental issue we face in Whatcom County is that any council that's going to make meaningful policy in community has to be willing to confront racism and poverty first. And that is usually the brick wall we run into. We're a rural county and those ideals are very entrenched. Capitalism and racism are just, they're in there. You know, that's no surprise to anyone, but the willingness to confront those issues, I think that's where the challenge is for a lot of traditionally established structures. And so at community to community, you know, we're in our 21st year, we're always led by farm workers. So we have a different process for direct democracy that is an assembly model, a tribunal model where farm workers themselves go to the legislature and deliver their priorities. We have much better success at the state level with that than at the local level. But I think what is needed is, I mean, it sounds so simple, but just giving the workers the power, which means how and when the meetings are, in what languages are they held, you know, thinking even just about, are there parliamentary procedures that are established by a structure that is deeply racist and capitalist in its core? So I'd say keeping people at the table is, the table has to be built by the people that you want to be there. And so it's not probably going to look like a typical council structure if it's led by people. I mean, maybe there will be food there. Maybe there will be, you know, it'll be maybe in a park or at someone's house. Like these kinds of things that are really simple are also deeply meaningful. And I think in Whatcom County anyway, when councils are led in a more traditional governance style, the only people who can show up are white academics. And so that's, you know, I think that is on the structure to figure out if you don't want the same thing, then you have to change the way you're doing it, right? And I think Dimka said that really well.
Thank you. Does anyone want to add?
I just want to add that I think it is a solvable solution, even though I think we've all kind of had some time, like years or even decades experience trying to do this kind of work. Even with the current situation going on, and even right now, our Food Advisory Council is being shifted or pivoted, as it were, due to the politics around land access. Because growers can't, you know, produce food without land. and workers, and not just in restaurants, but local unions. I think like not even a couple of years ago, some of the housekeeping and nannies came to the Food Advisory Council's Workforce Development Subcommittee some years ago with the Department of Labor, and we created the Fair Work Week, and we're able to get those workers the representation and even access to the union. We have, again, this is a union town, and the food workers do have a union, which changes or which helps the perspective as far as making sure the workers get paid. But again, issues of racism, poverty, classism, capitalism still impact the workers. Pittsburgh, Philly, other food advisory councils that I've spoken to, as well as yourselves. There is a way to solve it. And sometimes, and I saw someone mention about co-ops, sometimes it's a pivot or just a deeper bit of research to maneuver around some things while keeping the policy, the workers, and the workers' rights and the food safety at the foundation of that pivot. So because it sounds bad, but even with the challenges that we're going through right now at the end of the year, we are still meeting and working with folks and union folks to still deliver the food, deliver the workers' monies, and what have you, in even tumultuous times. So it's yay.
I think we need all the positive, ideas we can get, or energy right now. Thanks. I think, and I'll just add to what you were saying, Dimka, is obviously these solutions that we're hearing about, our ideas are really place-based. Like you said, Philly being a union town, Whatcom being a rural area. And so in different meetings, there were different ideas around what will work and what the challenges are too. So thanks for pointing that out. I might go to the next question about good food purchasing, and this is, what Colleen works on. So I might just ask you to answer this one to start. But how are food policy councils, labor advocates, and other partners engaging in a good food purchasing framework? And I'll say we added this because it was something that came up in a few different meetings.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think just to introduce myself really briefly, I'm Colleen McKinney, and I am with the Center for Good Food Purchasing, and we are a national organization that supports the adoption and implementation of the Good Food Purchasing program across the country, and we work closely with a number of core partners, both nationally, including Food Chain Workers Alliance, Heal Food Alliance, and Real Food Media, along with local coalitions in a number of cities across the country, cities and regions across the country to advance this work. So I just want to start by acknowledging that there's so much more complexity than what I can begin to state in my comments, but I wanted to give a little bit of background on sort of where the program framework was developed and how that has continued to support the Good Food Purchasing program as an effective organizing framework that includes labor as a central partner in the work. So the Good Food Purchasing framework was developed at the LA Food Policy Council, and Food Chain Workers Alliance was part of the working group and was co-leading the creation of the procurement strategy that became the Good Food Purchasing program with animal welfare, local businesses, public health leaders, municipal governments, and sustainability organizations. And I think from my perspective, at least, one of the many contributions of having Food Chain Workers Alliance as a leading partner in the conversation was their direct experience with how labor partners were organizing around procurement in other industries like the garment sector and construction industries, to achieve commitments like sweat-free policies for public garment supply chains. So these organizing strategies really informed and continue to inform the structure and strategy for the Good Food Purchasing policy and program. And Food Chain Workers Alliance and Heal Food Alliance continue to work with their members to add critical analysis to how the good food purchasing policy and its implementation can better serve outcomes for workers. So this, it continues to be a space for conversation and sort of holding the difficult complexities of managing, some of the priorities around local sourcing that many institutions hold alongside some of the areas that they tend to want to move away from when it gets hard, like labor and animal welfare. So the good food purchasing program what we ended up with was a model that equally weights the program values and ensures that institutions who adopt the good food purchasing program are making commitments to and advancing goals across all of the values of the program, including the ones, like I said, that typically get left behind most quickly, which are labor and animal welfare. So, I think that ultimately this framework is what all of our partners are able to organize around in terms of ensuring that policies that are adopted include all of those values, and that the good food purchasing program is an accountability mechanism to ensure that none of those values can get left behind, and to be really, to push back when institutions are starting to take steps back from any one of the values in the program. So I think in that way, that's sort of what gives it the power to continue to keep all of the partners in conversation and at the table. So yeah, I think right now there's currently about 13 coalitions across the country who are advocating for adoption and implementation of the good food purchasing program. Some of them are part of or coordinating with food policy councils and are working to ensure that good food purchasing commitments and policies are including labor, and that institutions are being transparent about the companies that they're doing business with. So really pushing for institutions to be who are adopting the program to be sharing information about their suppliers, who they're purchasing from, and which of those suppliers are known for having labor law violations as sort of a routine part of doing business, and starting to advocate to make shifts away from those suppliers toward those that are meeting the good food values, including more local and small scale businesses.
Thanks. Did anyone else want to add about good food purchasing? I know, Dimka, if you wanted to talk about Philadelphia, what you guys have been doing, or it's up to you.
Was looking for one of the links which we still use, the Good Food Catering Guide. It was a city or county-wide thing. Now it's turned into a statewide accessible to the public. And it goes not just for restaurants, but also for pantries, food fridges, something that we've developed in the last, I'd say maybe 3 or 4 years per, not just workers, but some of the city workers and other departments with the Department of Health and, with partnerships with the Food Trust and blah, blah, blah. I was going to drop the link into the city's Fair Work resources, because it's weird because we did so much in the past, which resulted in so much new jobs and of course new problems. But I mean, we kind of were the guinea pig when we were developing our Food Advisory Council. When we started in 2012, 2017 was kind of like our
She's frozen on my screen. Wait a minute, hope that she unfreezes.
humbling and great that, the community, like the entire community, relies on us, and it's amazing that we have partnerships with Pittsburgh and other, not just other councils, but farmers and workers and restaurants and everything. But I mean, yeah, and also I'm also available if anybody wants any other information. I'm also which is also really interesting. We helped develop a accountability measure for the community and the growers and the workers. As a federal and state chair, I represent the growers and the workers and the environmentalists in Philadelphia. So when people complain, and I do mean complain, I take those complaints directly to State Attorney General's office, the Inspector General, Utility Commission, and engage with the community as far as community outreach, neighbors associations. You currently see the situation that's going on here in Philadelphia with the against the stadium. That is all grassroots with varying folks with us also, just getting information, education, making sure folks are okay. They need mental, food help, work, job. Again, we try to do as much as we can, but we rely heavily within our community and our partnerships. So it's and still keeping that anti-capitalist, anti-racist, anti-classist framework with varying leaders and different groups. And we have a lot of caucuses. We try to meet. Being on Zoom has been a blessing to a lot of us with kids and who have very varying schedules. Knowing that we have a lot of data and subject matter experts where we can, if something happens, pop somebody in place at the last minute, just to fill in or just to report or gather information or even file complaints. So it's a lot of work, but it's energizing as well as challenging. And, like the pivoting part, you always have to adapt, be it the population shift or the political, or in our case, climate change. You always have to be adaptable and being able to engage varying races, cultures, and ages. So it kind of makes us a little, adaptable. Like, everybody comes and asks us questions, but I think it also works as a model for how you can have diverse people come together in different areas, class especially, race especially, and still have the foundation to move forward for the best of everybody's community.
So I think I'm going to go straight to our last question on what advice would you give to a council interested in but not yet addressing labor issues. And I also had forgotten to give everyone the chance to introduce themselves. So it would be great if everyone is comfortable answering this question. You can also add anything about your organization that we might have missed or about your work. And also, of course, any of the panelists that want to share anything can put that in the chat for people to access. So what advice would you give to a council interested in but not yet working on labor issues? And I'll just go in the order of how I see people on my screen. Sean, would you be okay starting us off?
Yeah. I think on the Whatcom Food System Committee, even among my colleagues, the other sector representatives, it's not fully understood that unions and worker-led organizations don't just resist the bad. They're innovators and they create the new. They create the new to address the imbalance in the power structure. And so one example from Whatcom County, from immigrant farm workers in Whatcom and Skagit County, is they often came from small community farms, where community farming villages, the idea of the ejido, and they bring that concept with them. And they were the essentially cooperative owners and stewards of the land. And so Liz can speak more to community developments projects, but there's a lot of innovation. And on the Food Systems Committee, what we did was excavated. We saw it as our role, I think, to excavate collaborative actions that were already existent or emergent, and then try to support those actions, to build on those actions, and to make sure that there was equitable investment in the actions of community-led actions of marginalized groups. And so I think that strategy is important and advice that I would give. I do think that we encountered sort of along the path that I would advise food policy councils not to see their role as the mediator of the conflicts that we know about between labor and employers, and to see their role more as doing what I just said, excavating collaborations. As the labor sector representative, essential farm worker and food workers are on the Whatcom Food Systems Committee, and we're there to collaborate. And so a little bit of going back to the last question, that strategy sort of tries to build an alliance among the sectors, across the sectors, to where there's eventually recognition that it's in all of our interests to collaborate in a way that benefits the whole community, and where we, all the sectors and all the stakeholders in the food system are benefit from the local food economy, and are not extracted from not having a food economy where a non-democratic food economy where one sector is extracted from, or one sector or a collection of sectors benefit from at the expense of other sectors.
Thank you. Liz, could you follow up with what Sean was speaking about?
Sure, yeah, thank you. And there was a question in the chat about wins from Tallulah. Thank you for that question. One thing that Sean actually experienced firsthand, and I didn't, but I can speak to a little bit, is that in the Food Systems Committee in Whatcom County, might have been the Food Network, actually, those things are run parallel, not interchangeable, but there was this question, this idea of stakeholders, and it's kind of this idea of like, everyone's experience is equally valid, or everyone's opinion is equally valid. And I think that there was some really meaningful questioning of the ag lobby versus workers, and that how that power dynamic changes the experience and the input of the quote unquote stakeholders. We can't just give everyone an equal vote in these spaces, so to speak, when one might be intimidating or bullying the other. And so I saw secondhand through that process that there was some real confrontation, because agriculture is hugely economically strong in our county, and that's all on the backs of the workers. But the owners come to these spaces fighting for to not be able to have to pay overtime, to not have to give any concessions for labor justice. And so having that, kind of hashing that out and recognizing that once you have labor at the table, that is a gift, and you don't want to, by sort of intimating that all things are equal, you can push that gift away. And so I think one piece of advice that came to my mind from the perspective of the work that we do is it's really important to question priorities and assumptions in those spaces. And coming into it, especially if you've been on a council or if you've been in any kind of governance before, you might be used to a certain kind of framework that does naturally push out workers and low-income people and people of color. So questioning those things is really helpful. And also, I saw a lot of good summary in the presentation earlier about building trust, and I hear that. I also think there's work that even like, if you're in a group that has no workers in it, you can still look at policy and see where the equity problems are, and analyze those things with curiosity rather than saying no workers came, so we can't do any labor justice. Like, I think anyone can look at existing policy and see what is racist and inherently anti-labor about it. So that could be a good place to start, and doing that publicly and transparently might draw more participation. So kind of flipping inside out, that what do we have to have first? Do the workers need to be here for us to move forward? Or if there's no workers, what would be an equitable way to start engaging this so that we can, like, building that trust is action-based, not just hoping over time that people will trust you automatically.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to follow up with a couple of quick things. You'd mentioned, Laura Ann, about we skipped introductions. And so one of the things I wanted to mention is just technical. The Whatcom Food Systems Committee is a government entity. It was founded by the county executive and the county council, and it was tasked with drafting a food system plan, implementing that food system plan, and then overseeing and updating that food system plan. We're currently in the early stages of implementation. The Whatcom Food Network was a voluntary association of community stakeholders that was founded in 2011. And one of their expressed goals was to have their work lead to the establishment of a food system committee, which was realized 9 years later. So I just wanted to talk about that. And then I wanted to follow up with what Liz was saying about priorities. One thing I was struck by in the data that was presented was not so much the deterioration of labor as a priority on food policy councils, but the discrepancy between how it was a priority and then the 50% that did, sort of erode to 30% of the policy councils that said they were engaged with labor in the way that Liz is suggesting. And it causes me to doubt the second suggestion, because if you were really engaging the identified leadership of labor, I feel like the labor issue would be one of your top priorities. So I just wanted to add that.
In the short amount of time, I can actually kind of answer what you're talking about with a very interesting example. We used to have a zero waste committee here in Philadelphia. The result of that committee was the food fridges that we have in South Philadelphia and all along Germantown Avenue, which feed people directly. The moment we were successful in bringing these food fridges to our county, the mayor at the time dissolved the committee of food waste. It was a huge thing, but also included we all understand Clarence Thomas and how certain kinds of Black folks or Black people like to support white supremacy and capitalism. This was a white mayor at the time, and he was told to dissolve the committee by specific ethnicities who support capitalism and white supremacy, because it cut into some of the bottom line for certain restaurants that were directly restaurants and businesses that were directly feeding the poor. We actually cut out the middleman, giving away free food and giving the restaurants a tax-free way to dispose of food. So even though they've dissolved the committee, we still have the food fridges. So, but in that dissolving of the council, we were able to at least develop the system where we have community workers or community people who have those particular jobs maintaining those food fridges throughout the city. So yeah, I agree with you so much. And I definitely agree with you as far as the councils being used for outreach and what have you. When these harder issues come up, being able to reach out to other organizations if there's a legal issue, aka the Philadelphia restaurant settlement for the workers, things of that nature. So as I always say, Philly gives you the good, the bad, and the let's solve that. And some of the things that honestly you can Google on the news and see certain kinds of food related issues, problem, solution, and then see in our data as far as restaurant workers, food workers, growers, the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Thank you. Colleen, did you want to give us just kind of a, advice for food policy councils that want to get involved in labor, and then we might go to audience questions. So people can, we've already seen there's a question in the chat, but anyone else that wants to put in a question while we're finishing this question up.
Yeah, I think I don't have a ton to add to everything that's been shared already. But I would think that from my perspective, just, specifically working on one policy area, the good food purchasing program and policy, just what I appreciate about it is that it's a policy commitment that requires a commitment to labor as part of the holistic set of strategies, and that like staying committed to that framework and not taking like the easy win by letting labor go, but like sticking resolutely to that is, I think an opportunity to start to build that trust. So that everyone has talked so eloquently about, and I don't have much to add to, but I think that's what I appreciate about that as a framework. And I think that it's, a policy that is well suited to be advocated for in cross-sectoral spaces like food policy councils. So I think, just that's what I appreciate. And in terms of thinking about, policy opportunities that can bring and keep labor at the table, and encourage the spaces for the tough conversations and the building the comfort with sort of sitting with multiple truths being true at one time, I think is what I appreciate about the space that policy creates within campaigns and coalitions. So I will leave it at that for now.
So a question that came up a little while ago, and I think relates to what Colleen was just speaking about too, is from Tallulah. She said, curious if you all have examples of wins of people with, and I think actually Liz already started to address this, people with power in food policy councils being willing to release their power to make progress as a food policy council. Did anyone else want to address that question?
Again, Philly, sometimes I feel like I talk so much, because Philly does so much, it's like a hydra of policy work. In 2019, prior to the pandemic, our program manager through the Office of Sustainability was a white woman, and she made a mission statement within the council, or at least within the council's development, to promote Black, Brown, Hispanic, Indigenous, immigrant workers in the food system into a manager position, to make sure that they were local, to make sure us appointed members are workers, or at least impacted workers in farming or the restaurant business here in Philly. And she was very successful. We are the only community supported organization that passed a lot of equity and, or I want to say equity training, but equity stuff. As far as like farm services and NRCS, getting the unions involved, being able to adapt as needed, which was great. But, now we're having a situation with, politics, but even now with some new members, that has been our foundation as far as just engaging with the community and making sure that workers and food safety are at the forefront. A majority of the appointed and of all membership, even our the lowest of members, new members even, they're all either a minority or underserved or in some way, shape, or form a marginalized person or group, or represents a person or group. And everyone is, just working towards the same goal, which is to feed and to make sure that the workers are good. So that was our big success. But, now we're growing, I guess you can call it growing pains, but it happens.
So the next question here is, can you talk about the relationship between the types of funding and funders, how this creates challenges and or opportunities regarding food policy councils and their attention to food and farm workers? And I will just say that we do talk about that in the report a bit, because this, of course, did come up. And I'll also just add that I think it really depends on the type of council, whether it's, within the city government, like in Philly, or some of the more grassroots food policy councils that are really needing to kind of get funding to function. But I'll open it up to other people to answer. So this question of how funding affects the ability to pay attention to food and farm workers.
Well, the road to labor staying engaged in the Whatcom Food Systems Committee was not, it was a bumpy road. The biggest risk to us is that we wouldn't be recognized as an equal partner, and that we would actually have to oppose the food system plan. And because we would be viewing ourselves as being co-opted. But going to the positive, and this speaks a little to the question in the chat about wins, is that we have been able to engage, and we have gotten some wins, especially at the state level, because we have a pretty developed infrastructure that that's taken time over time. We have an independent farm worker union, one of the only ones in the country. We passed, I think it's now there are two, but we passed the first farm worker overtime bill, and it fought the last two legislative sessions in Washington state to keep it and not let the Farm Bureau put in an exemption, a seasonal exemption. And I think Liz can speak more to some of those wins, but in terms of funding, the Food System Committee, we put in a goal. Our goal one was equity. And that was seen as a way as trying to provide an equity lens, which we're still trying to understand, to our action plan. So one of the ways that is applied is we put in the language of buy-in for led organizations. And a buy-in for led organization is like community to community development. It's led by and for farm workers. It's like our, and there are other examples from other communities. The Tenants Union is an organization in Whatcom County led by and for tenants. And so we said that by and for led communities, one of our actions was, but in this equity goal that serves as sort of a governor for all the other actions, is that when you invest in community-led projects, you need to invest equitably into these by and for led organizations. And we didn't define that, but now we've set up a measurement, right? We've set up a metric. Liz can speak more to some of the wins, but at the state level, this sort of culminates in a very strong Latino caucus, farm worker tribunal every year at the legislative session, and some of the wins that we've had.
Okay, quickly, I'll just follow up on that. I think funders and types of funding are so complicated, especially getting more complicated all the time. If you're within a governmental body that has a budget line item that is stable, that's amazing. And then you're also beholden to all kinds of rules depending on what state you're in and what your state law says about your structure. At C2C, we've been really fortunate to not accept funding that requires of us certain things that would put our membership at risk. And that's been 21 years of balancing that. I don't know. Hopefully that can go on for 40 more years or more. But I do see the constraints, especially in the nonprofit world, especially in the climate that we're in right now, of having to hoop jump and compromise values in order to secure funding. I think that's absolutely rotten. And I wish I could just say, don't do it, but I understand the reality of having to pay for things. I know that at our county level, you know, the first thing they start cutting is staff support for committees that they don't see as essential to the operation of government. And so we are in a county and state budget crisis right now. How realistic that is, but that's what we're told. So things like stipends for low-income workers are the first thing to go. And so there is a built-in equity problem with government funding, obviously. And there's no security, there's no stability for committees that are trying to do this kind of groundbreaking work that Sean is talking about. So I think that's a huge bummer. And I think it does pull money away from anyone who's doing just transition or climate justice work. Those frameworks that are so essential have become highlighted as at risk in many different funding structures for many different reasons, a lot of them political. Yeah, I don't know if that answers the question, but I'm just saying funding is so complicated on every level right now.
Agree. And as you were saying, positioning for the council, we are a state council, but you know, the larger state of Pennsylvania. Oh, thank you. But our funding is nonprofit and or private. William Penn, was it Murdoch, the pharmaceutical company here, they give us a lot of money to ensure that appointed members like myself get a stipend every year to do this kind of work, and we've actually we've actually worked through our partnerships as well as with PASA and farm services and what have you. We use equity money, considering that most of us farmers have federal farm numbers. We're registered with the state and fed here in Pennsylvania. We've used, but we've had policy advocates such as myself over the years, honestly, just kind of backdoor it and find the funding that, be it a grant or non-matching grants. We don't like those anyway, but find a grant or a private public funder, neighborhood association, or, and I hate to say it this way, but white savior money, and using that kind of money in a way to make sure that the workers have wages, or folks like myself are paid, make sure we have insurance or emergency money for stuff. And sometimes it was very difficult, because the funding issue was a very difficult part, because we don't want to be capitalistic, and we're also, even though we're a city that's supposedly rich, we are not. And it's like it's like we have to stick to our foundation of what we decided to do, but knowing that money and making sure that folks have a livable wage, medical coverage and what have you is sound. So I think what we've had is an interesting access of privilege information to grant information, of getting that grant information directly to members in the council, our treasurers and things like that, with the city. But on the flip side, because we're not, we have a specific kind of soft power in a local government that completely ignores food and ag and everything else that we work for. It also gives them an opportunity to take any money that we have for any of our partners that support us, and them to manipulate or mismanage those fundings to hinder our partners, or even us, depending on where the funding comes from. So that's that challenge that we're kind of working through right now. What is our position within not just city government, even though we know where we stand with the state and the federal government and in our communities, and how we're going to move forward, since now that other communities are more understanding of what that financial aspect is. We now have an opportunity to be a strictly community supported, funded with our partners, private community organization for worker food and farming out oversight. So we're literally, we got a meeting next week, kind of trying to figure what we're going to do coming into the new year. And, but honestly, the privilege of being a farmer that's displaced, being a federal chair, a federal state chair, having access to the equip list with farm services and varying groups that want to give us that kind of money to make sure that we're able to complete our mission and keeping, you know, in our foundation. Yeah, it's a lot. And also having a CPA and a treasurer that is licensed helps immensely as far as how we can move and what impacts we have.
I just wanted to, sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to quickly give a shout out to Molly in the chat. Rosalind is also a mentor of mine. Thanks for sharing the work that you're doing now. I would just encourage you by saying that community development's cooperative development program has evolved quite a bit to the point where we've now established an in-house land trust for the cooperatives to be able to steward the land in climate smart and food sovereignty fashion, all in the values of just transition economic development. Although we navigate the contradictions like everybody else. And that was really extended from what we've talked about earlier, from that the vision comes from immigrant farm workers themselves and, you know, their experience in the community farm worker village, the Ejidos in Mexico.
I was muted. You just jumped in to do exactly what I was going to ask, was this last question in the chat from Molly about an overlap between worker cooperative development and incubation among food policy councils. And so I think Sean just kind of addressed that, unless anyone else wants to jump in. She also asked, I wondered if there were data trends between rural and urban areas among surveyed policy councils. And I can kind of answer that, but also wanted to give Jonnell or Frank the opportunity to have some final thoughts here. And knowing that we're kind of getting close to the end, either addressing either of those questions, or if people had final thoughts on the panel that they just wanted to share as well, since we'll probably end pretty soon.
Yeah, I think we'd have to look back to see any specific trends, if you will, but because it was a qualitative study that relied on interviews and focus groups, and the case study participants varied so much, we just didn't have enough data, if you will, or enough data points to make any assessments about, you know, urban does it this way, or this has been more effective in rural areas. So from what we've done so far, no, I don't think we could really point to any specific trends.
We have some recent data. Sorry, we have some recent data because our land bank is a problem here in Philadelphia. I will try to get you this most recent data since it's end of the year report on at least the trend here on the East Coast and in Pittsburgh, as far as rural and urban. It just popped up the email, so I'll make sure I'll get you that data and you can disseminate it to the group.
And thank you everyone who's added a lot in the chat. There's been a lot of, you know, kind of sharing of resources on there as well. And I don't know, Karen, if you wanted to put a link to the report again, if anyone came in late, I don't have it. But if anyone wants to share anything else in the chat, you know, from a lot's been shared, from kind of looking at labor issues to food fridges to food cooperatives. So it's a great resource to have everyone here. Any final things people in the panel wanted to share that we didn't get to cover, or Jonnell or Frank from the report that we didn't go through, or the research in general, or Karen? You've been really central to all of this. we covered everything.
And nothing from my end. I think you are pretty good.
Yeah, I mean, I think we just are, as we're talking about here, it's just kind of the tip of the iceberg with trying to uncover how to address these really structurally difficult questions. We didn't get into so much of what are the challenges, why do food policy councils not do these things? There's, again, more of that in the research. We also spoke with groups that have not been successful in incorporating labor for some of the reasons that we've already been talking about. But I think, power being a really big issue for obvious reasons. And then, I think genuinely food policy councils that are really interested in doing this work, but feel that they need to build stronger alliances so the food policy council doesn't implode or fall apart when they start addressing labor, right? And I think that depends on the local situation. Are there strong labor groups working in their region or not that they can partner with? And it's not the same everywhere. So, I'm just really grateful to everyone that came today to attend, really to all the panelists, some that jumped in just this week. And also just for everyone that's been taking part in this research with, filling out surveys and answering our questions and sitting down and meeting with us. So we really hope that this is helpful. This was the point of this study, is to provide really, publicly available information on how to address labor injustice in the food system through food policy councils. So please reach out to me or Jonnell or Frank if you have more questions, or any of our panelists. I'll put my email in the chat, and anyone else that wants to do that can as well. And a final just big thank you to Karen and Anne from Center for Livable Future for hosting all of us today. But thank you all.
Thank you all
Thanks
for
so much,
being here.
everyone.
Thank you.